It's 8:01. Welcome to everyone online and also those who will view this recording at a later date when it's convenient for them. I am Associate Professor Fiona Charlson from the University of Queensland School of Public Health and the Queensland Centre for Mental Health Research. I lead the University of Queensland Mental Health and Climate Change Transdisciplinary Research Network. This is our second webinar in a series of webinars that we'll be holding this year and next year in the coming months. I want to start this morning, as always, with an acknowledgement of country. If we can go to the next slide, please, Liz. Thank you. So in the spirit of reconciliation, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, wherever you are based today, and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, in fact, all First Nations peoples who might be viewing this today. Thank you. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. Please keep yourself muted. This session will be recorded. It will also be uploaded to our website if you wish to view that at a later date. If you do have any questions, and we really strongly encourage you to ask questions, there is a Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box. These will be collated throughout this morning's webinar, and you can upvote questions. If you see one that you already were wanting to ask, you can actually, there's an upvote function there, and we'll respond to those questions at the end of this webinar this morning. Just a reminder who UQ MHCC-TN is, in case we have some new people online today. This is an Australian-focused with collaborations overseas research network, Transdisciplinary Research Network, with a strongly applied research focus and approach to addressing the social, mental and emotional health impacts of climate change. We specialise in mental health for communities impacted by climate change events and focus on research, evidence and solution. It was established in 2019 in direct response to the growing need of government and industry for an evidence base that supports interventions, tools and policies to protect social and emotional wellbeing in climate change. We coordinate and expand research activities with university and our many partners, some of you who you will meet today online, and we really harness the transdisciplinary expertise for greater innovation and impact. And we bring together a critical mass of research within this growing area of concern. If you wish to join the network, please subscribe to our mailing list on the website, and you can just quickly take a photo on your phone of the QR code, which will take you directly to our website. If you're interested in co-designing a research project, please reach out to us. And we also have a number of PhD and MPH or high degree research opportunities available, some of which are on our website, but we are open to any topics. So if you have something in mind of your own, also reach out to us and we'll connect you with the appropriate researchers. Thanks very much. So now I'm going to introduce you to our amazing lineup of panel members this morning, starting with Rupert Saunders from Headspace. Rupert is the Manager of Clinical Advice and Governance and the Acting Head of Participation and Lived Experience at Headspace. He is a registered psychologist who has worked in various roles within Headspace since 2014, including service delivery, service improvement and advisory roles. Currently, Rupert works to ensure Headspace's mental health messaging, clinical resources, campaign, digital media and the media is evidence-informed and clinically safe. Rupert also facilitates the safe participation of young people and family and friends at Headspace. Welcome, Rupert. Carla Sargeant from Yourtown Kids Helpline at School program. Carla has been very fortunate to have a diverse range of career experiences in leading mental health and wellbeing programs for children, youth and families. which include adventure-based learning, supporting young people experiencing homelessness, literacy and numeracy programs, alcohol and other drug counselling, school re-engagement programs, animal and music therapy, mental health literacy, and health-seeking education and family mediation. Her work at Kids Helpline has led to Yourtown co-designing climate change and mental health resources for communities that have been impacted by natural disasters. Her education background is in psychology, education and youth work, juvenile justice and community development. Welcome, Carla. Really great to have you here. Our third panellist is our youth representative today. Tianna is 23 and uses they, them pronouns and is the Youth Participation Assistant at Yourtown. Tianna was on the steering committee for Your Voice and wrote the introductory remarks for the final report. They are currently part of the Foundation for Young Australians Collective Imagining project and are nominated for out of Australia's 30 Under 30 Award for their efforts to bring LGBTQIA+ inclusivity into the conversation in their workplace and community. Welcome, Tianna. Thank you so much for joining us. Andy Gore from Outback Futures. Andy is the project lead for the Resilient Kids and Youth Project at Outback Futures. Outback Futures is a not-for-profit organisation committed to long-term whole-of-community change in mental health and wellbeing outcomes for the Outback. They are currently working in the Central West and Northwest corridors in Queensland and empowering Outback communities to thrive. Developed with the bush and for the bush, the Outback Futures community facilitation model combines genuine community engagement, multidisciplinary mental and allied health clinics, along with regular and consistent Stay With Me video connect support across the lifespan. At the heart of their work is to renew hope, build resilience, and strengthen the community. And a very big welcome to you as well, Andy. We have two UQ researchers, part of our research network with us today. Dr. Vercammen, the University of Queensland, Senior Research Fellow at the School of Communication and Arts. Her background is in cognitive and behavioural science and psychology. She was previously a researcher with the Centre for Environmental Policy at Imperial College in the UK from 2017 to 2021. Her research focuses on environmental issues and how they affect individual and collective human health and wellbeing, for example, the human dimensions of environmental change, with a particular interest in how people emotionally connect with nature, determinants of pro-environmental behaviour, the health and wellbeing benefits of nature exposure, and the mental health impacts of climate change. Thanks, Arns, for joining us today. We have Tara Crandon, who is a psychologist and a PhD candidate at the University of Queensland. Tara is currently undertaking her PhD with the Child and Youth Mental Health Research Group at QIMR Berghofer Medical Research Institute. She is also a psychologist who is passionate about working with children, adolescents and young adults. Her PhD research focuses on how children and adolescents are psychologically responding to climate change. More specifically, she is interested in climate anxiety in adolescents, particularly defining and measuring this experience. Welcome, ladies. Thank you. I am going to now hand over to Arns, followed by Tara, who are going to just briefly outline some of the research that they have been doing with children and youth in response in the impacts of climate change on their mental health, which is the focus of today's webinar. Thanks, Arns.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Thanks for the introduction. And thank you for having me. Okay, I'm going to see if I can actually control the slides now. Should be able to. Sorry about that. Doesn't seem to be moving. Sorry. Hang on. We did practice this. Okay, let's see. Seems to be very slow, but thank you. In any case, what I will do today is present a few research highlights from a program that I've been involved in at Imperial College London and still involved in. So Climate Cares is what it's called, and it brings together researchers, policy experts, educators, designers, all aiming to understand and support mental health and well-being in the climate crisis. Sorry, Liz, I'm trying to advance to the next slide. I think it's going very slow, but so bear with me. So the work of Climate Care sort of separates out into three key work streams. I myself have been mainly involved in what we call the evidence part, which is aimed at generating primary research to understand the nature of psychological responses to and perceptions of the climate crisis, and to establish whether there are potential win-wins for both climate and mental health. So basically asking us the question, can we support people to take climate action in a way that's both effective and protective of their well-being? Climate Cares also engages in education and outreach to raise awareness of the hidden costs of climate change. And we also work on designing innovative tools. Well, we co-design these with, for instance, young people to create spaces for people to safely explore and take ownership of their climate feelings or climate anxiety, in the end to enable them to engage in meaningful action. Okay. So I'll take you to a little quick tour of our research. So our first set of empirical studies that we did as Climate Cares was part of a program that we called Changing Worlds. So this was focused on young people's psychological responses to the threat of climate change during the additional challenge of living through a pandemic. We conducted similar surveys in multiple nations, as you can see, sort of with the arrows pointed on the map. I'm just going to speak about findings from the UK, the US, and three Caribbean countries. So that's Guyana, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago. So across all these countries, we measured a range of psychological factors that related specifically to people's experience and responses to climate change and the pandemic, as well as asking them questions about their overall health and well-being. Our aim was to understand the link between those specific responses and to what extent climate-related distress and climate anxiety was affecting their day-to-day living and their future orientation, so their plans for the future. So starting off in the UK, we ran the survey mid to late 2020, which is at the height of the pandemic there, so lots of restrictions and lockdowns. We did find that climate change was not a major worry for most of the respondents when they were asked about their own plans for their own future. And that was sort of in direct comparison to other factors like the economy, jobs, career, and recovery from the pandemic. That was despite the fact that many of the students, the respondents expressed a sense of distress and great concern over climate change, but it does appear to be sort of in a more abstract sense, and not that they're linking it directly to their future prospects, or not, at least not their immediate future prospects. We did find, however, that psychological distress experienced about climate change was increased in young people with pre-existing anxiety symptoms, as well as for young people who told us that they were receiving treatment for a mental health condition. On average, though, in the sample, the effect of the climate anxiety, climate distress on their day-to-day living, so whether they were sleeping, were able to socialize, etc., that was reported as being quite minimal by these respondents. I am still trying to get this slides to advance, which they're not doing, which is a little annoying, so I really apologize for that. Here we go, very slowly. And right. So moving on to the Caribbean, we actually observed quite a similar result in the sense that their current concern and distress was slightly higher for climate change than for COVID-19, for the pandemic, which we thought was quite interesting and consistent finding. So that's sort of that abstract sense of concern and distress. However, when we asked them about sort of to what extent that those feelings and thoughts around those two crises affected their day-to-day living, they were definitely on a day-to-day basis concerned more with the pandemic, because it was affecting, you know, their activities on a day-to-day basis. The other difference between the two their responses to the two issues were their specific feelings. We found that young people in the Caribbean were more engaged and concerned, so quite positively engaged with the climate crisis, but also felt more guilt and shame. So those negative emotions were definitely there as well, which we sort of considered as potentially due to a lack of opportunities to enact change with respect to climate change. Like their UK counterparts, young people in the Caribbean were also concerned about financial security, career and studies in the short term. So while climate change was definitely on their minds, the concern seems to be overtaken by practical and immediate worries about their personal goals, which I guess is fair and potentially indicative of them being in that particular developmental stage where they're advancing in life and making, important life choices for their future. Okay, so finally, just a quick tour of the US. We found that most of the young people that we surveyed in the US had experienced some specific and direct climate impact, so around extreme weather events, generally speaking. So we asked them about sort of what events that they had experienced. I think air pollution and sort of extreme temperatures were pretty common. And we did find that among the people who told us that they had experienced direct impacts, they had more climate anxiety than the people who had not experienced direct impacts. And that was in particular linked to wildfires more than other impacts. Just very briefly at the end, the extent to which climate change was a factor in their, we asked them to what extent they factored climate change into their sort of future plans and their thinking about their futures. And we found that that was also determined by whether or not they'd had direct experiences. Most strikingly, people who told us they'd experienced direct climate impacts were more likely to want to learn more about climate change in the future, felt a sense of urgency to go and visit places and experience things before climate change made it impossible, and were reconsidering having children or planning their families, as well as making personal lifestyle changes. And that was compared to people who had not experienced direct impacts. So I'll leave it there and I'll hand over to Tara.
Thanks, Ans. I'm just requesting control. Okay, I think it should work now. Hi, everybody. It's so good to be here. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about my PhD research as well. I'm still collecting a lot of the results for this PhD, so unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to share a lot of the results. I'm still kind of under the process of analysing everything. So I thought I would just walk you through what we have done so far and what we're hoping to do in the future. So really, my PhD topic is centered around two key goals. The first is to understand and conceptualize what climate anxiety is from a psychological perspective. And then the second is to be able to screen or measure for that experience in young people. And I think I'm having a slow slide problem too. There we go. I'd first like to acknowledge that climate anxiety is very much an understandable and reasonable response. It can be that initial alarm bell that's telling you that something needs to change. But we can see that it's different for different people. So we might see that it ranges in how severe it is and how adaptive it might be. Now, climate anxiety is a relatively unmapped concept. So as part of my PhD, we've developed a model to try to understand what the experience actually involves. And this is a complex model. So I've distilled the key points in a basic format. And what this model illustrates is that climate anxiety involves feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And these thoughts and behaviors can range on a spectrum from unhelpful to helpful. So if someone is having unhelpful thoughts, like maybe they're ruminating or maybe they're acting in unhelpful ways, like avoiding the crisis or the situation, we might see that this negatively impacts their functioning. Let's say they feel overwhelmed, they feel paralyzed by their anxiety. But if someone's thinking in helpful ways, maybe thinking about their role on the planet or maybe problem solving the issue, maybe they're acting in helpful ways like acting pro-environmentally or supporting other people, then we might see a gain in their functioning. So maybe they're more connected to their values or their social supports. Now, young people can be particularly affected by climate anxiety. So research shows that young people are more likely to experience climate anxiety than adults. They're more vulnerable developmentally, physically, and psychologically to the negative impacts of climate change. And we also know they're more likely to be predisposed or exposed to climate-related stresses like natural disasters across their full lifespan. And we discussed this in more depth in a paper that we published at the start of the year in Nature Climate Change. And I'm just waiting for the slides to roll over. And in this paper, we really just illustrate the different ways that young people might experience climate anxiety and how their surrounding environments, like their parents, their family, their school, their community, their governments, can especially shape whether their anxiety is going to be helpful or unhelpful. Now, this area of research is relatively new and emerging, and much of this emerging research looks at how young people, typically aged 16 and above, are coping with climate change. Yet adolescence in particular might be a really crucial period of time where we should start screening for climate anxiety, so roughly from the age of 12 to 17. And that's because during this time, young people are really learning the gravity of the situation. And so we see in research that they may be more hopeless than children as well as young adults. Maybe they have a little bit less independence and ability to act. And we also know that during adolescence, this is a really vulnerable period of time for mental health. So approximately 50% of mental health problems are likely to come up in adolescence and then persist into adulthood. So we really do need to start screening for this experience as early as adolescence so that we can help young people channel their anxiety in some of those more helpful ways that will be protective of their well-being. So during my PhD, we're undertaking two projects. The first is called the How I Feel About Climate Change survey. So we're surveying Australian young people aged 12 to 17 through social media and schools. And we're really just asking questions to try to better understand what are the components of climate anxiety. So the kinds of thoughts, the emotions, the behaviours that they're having, and whether there is that range of adaptivity and severity from unhelpful to helpful. And we're hoping to use some of that information to inform a scale that we'll be developing. And so the second project that we have is using some of that information that we've gathered to develop a scale that can be used to screen for climate anxiety, which we're then hoping we can roll out into schools that mental health professionals could use and mental health services. And part of this has involved consulting with the youth advisory group to make sure that the scale is measuring what climate anxiety is from their perspective, as well as experts in the field of climate anxiety and scale development. And we're really hoping to collect data globally, mostly through social media, but also potentially we will again invite schools to participate. And we're hoping to collect a clinical sample by inviting youth mental health organisations to work with us on getting some more survey data. So we're looking to roll out this survey towards the end of this year through to mid-2023. Just very slow, sorry guys. Awesome. So really that's just a bit of an overview of everything that we've done so far for my PhD and where we're hoping to go. As I said, we're still analysing some of the results from that first survey and we're working through developing the scale for the second survey. And so hopefully I'll be able to share results with you very soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Uns and Tara, for giving us a really lovely overview of some important research that's taking place in this space and within our network. I'm going to sort of throw it open to our panellists now. Andy, I might start with you. Could you tell us a little bit about your Resilient Kids project? You know, the sort of work that you're undertaking. And in terms of the Outback or rural Queensland, what your observations are in terms of the mental health impacts of climate-related events among the children and youth that you're working with?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Tianna, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to share a little bit about the work that we're doing in Outback parts of Queensland. So we currently have developed a program called the Resilient Kids and Youth Project under our banner of Outback Futures. And it's really a program specifically designed for Outback kids and youth to help build resilience so they're equipped to bounce forward when facing disasters and their own personal challenges of their own internal worlds as well. And so we've designed a series of workshops and video series specifically designed for kids and youth and parents in remote parts of Queensland. And we're hoping that by the end of our work in that area over the next year in these different series of workshops and videos, that kids will be able to say, I have people who love me and help me, and they can identify those really easily. I am a person who knows myself well about those values and is considerate of others, how I'm actually enacting my values in my social environment. And also that I can solve problems and proactively manage my emotions during those challenges that could be those severe weather events as well. And so, Fiona, you asked about our sort of observations of those mental health impacts in that climate related events, and particularly in the remote parts of our country and Queensland where we're based at the moment. You know, there's this focused thought in those remote areas of what they're going through, specifically the severe drought that they've had over the last decade. And in Queensland, there's been a recent relief of that, thankfully. But it has highlighted the distinction between the sustained weather events that are occurring, particularly in remote areas, but also then the acute weather events, such as the 2019 floods that occurred in the northwest. And they impact very differently and compound that we've seen on top of each other. So when people and young people and families are experiencing these sustained weather events, plus an acute weather event, that then compounds those feelings of isolation, and that remoteness rises up. And one of our OTs and one of our clients recently, an 11-year-old said in one of their sort of sessions that she'd never ever seen rain like they've experienced before. So at 11 years old, and that was a day's worth of solid rain that followed on to a good week's worth of soaking rain, that she'd never experienced anything like that in her memory bank. And that highlights that the duration of the sustained weather events for young people and how they're experiencing that in their lifetime. One of the other things is the related effects of the stoicism of some people in our remote context of just keep going, and maybe an undefined sense of what resilience is for some people. And what I'd also like to say is that in those spaces, we know that it's really hard as we've journeyed with families to flourish when they're in that survival mode for such long periods. And so we know that the impacts of these weather events and sustained weather events as well impact the whole family system, for particularly the work-related things on property, that stay or go mentality. Should we pack up the property? What does that look like? The grief and loss of animals that occurred during the severe weather events, and then the confusion or guilt and shame that can occur with that as well, or they experienced it a lot worse than me. And I'm not sure quite how to help in this time as well. So there's some of the insights for us.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. You've made some really good points there, and it's pretty clear. It's I would say a bit of a new landscape out in the outback. In fact, in a lot of places where, as you've mentioned, we've now got these cumulative events where something we used to know, perhaps, or expect in terms of these extreme weather events, which Australia is not unfamiliar with. We're a country where we have a long history of those types of events, but they're now sort of rolling on top of one another. And, you know, that undefined sense of resilience is an important one. What does resilience mean for communities in this era of climate change? So, yeah, thanks so much, Andy. Carla, I might go to you now. And you've undergone a lot of consultation with youth as part of the Kids Helpline at School program. I'm really curious to hear about that experience and a little bit about the program. And I might also just mention that you've been working very closely with Tianna. So Tianna, it'd be great to hear from you about your experience of that consultation process as well.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having us as well. And It's great to be a part of the conversation around it because, like many of us, particularly in the mental health field, experiencing mental health concerns related to climate change for a lot of us is a very new area. And for us at Yourtown, I guess an important step in a lot of our program development is, first of all, listening and hearing community experiences and stories, which is, it's been, as Andy mentioned, it's been a cumulative effect for many of our communities that have gone through quite an ordeal through the pandemic, and a lot of the communities we work with are on the southeast coast of Australia where they experience multiple extreme weather impacts. And I think an area for us that was really remarkably different too was the perception that young people had on the cumulative experience on their mental health. We noticed a marked difference between speaking with different developmental groups and stages around their experience and what they were expressing as concerns. And there was a particular group of young people that we were working with where in a remote rural community, we were talking about their experience in an extreme weather event, which, as Andy had mentioned, had come after nearly a decade of drought for their community. So this young woman had seen some of the impacts on her community group where her friends at school were leaving the community. People were choosing to move to metropolitan regions. There had been a significant impact on families' livelihoods, which was predominantly a farming community. And this young woman was saying, talking about her experience and her journey through this process. And she was expressing concerns of, what does this look like in the future? This continue to keep happening. What does the future look like for us as a community? And a growing concern amongst that cohort of young people of, are we going to be able to stay in our homes, in our communities? And for young people, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people and families in that community, they express concerns about leaving their country. So these impacts, I guess for us in the mental health, as a mental health practitioner, I definitely felt what was my role in climate change and how do these relate. But after that workshop with young people, it was just absolutely apparent that the impacts on communities and individuals, and particularly in this circumstance, and the stories that we heard are in adolescents as well too, was particularly troubling. And I'm really grateful to be part of the conversation about what we can start having proactive conversations around how we're supporting young people with mental health and climate change. And Tianna, who's with us here today, was part of our Your Voice project where young people, I think we had Tianna around 3,000 influences, and we formed recommendations around environmental change.
Yeah, Your Voice was a survey of 3,500 young people across Australia. Sorry if my voice sounds weird. I had a cold recently. 46% of the young people that participated in the survey said that the environment was an issue for them and that they were concerned about it. So the survey was mostly focused on federal political decisions and policies and stuff like that. And so young people kind of indicated that they didn't feel that they had any trust in the government to take care of the environment and to listen to them and to seriously consider that they were feeling concerned about the state of the universe as a whole and the state of the planet and the state of the country. The young people came from across like urban and rural areas, and 23% of the young people that were in the survey indicated that their mental health was impacted by the environment and the state of the environment. Amongst the younger people, 15 to 17-year-olds, the environment was a higher issue in terms of federal policy, whereas amongst the older group, 18 to 25, it was about number 6, because they had bigger concerns about employment and immediate sort of stuff like Ans and Tara were kind of talking about. The younger teenage group were a bit more concerned about the environment. but overall everyone was quite anxious, and there was a lot of feelings of hopelessness, distrust, uncertainty, and feeling like their voices weren't being heard, and also being scared to make decisions about their future. So there were young people saying they were concerned about deciding to have children. They were concerned about what jobs that would be available for them. They were concerned about if they'd ever get to live the lives that their parents or their grandparents had gotten to live. And they felt very much a sense of unfairness in terms of how the adults were running things. And yeah, so that was what came out of Your Voice. And I was on the steering committee for that. So I got to read all the comments and all the data, which was really exciting because I'm a nerd. So I had a really good time looking at all the background stuff, and I had got to help write questions as well. So that was really fun for me.
Yeah. Perfect role for you, Tianna, sounds like. I'd like to maybe come back to, we'll go to Rupert now, but I'd like to come back to that really interesting point that's been made by a few of you on the panel today about differences between, we tend to talk about youth as if they're one kind of homogenous group, but actually what we're hearing is that there are different age groups who have different concerns and maybe similar concerns, but they're prioritising them in different ways. Be interesting to maybe circle back to why that might be. Tara, I think you might have some thoughts on that. And also sort of think about that when we come to talk about potential solutions in a little while. Rupert, I'll come to you now. Thanks for joining us today. You've been engaging a lot with youth, such as Tianna. I'd really like to hear about Headspace's work in this space, and particularly, your experiences in your role.
Yeah, thanks for that, Fiona. Headspace is certainly engaged in the conversation around how do we support young people who may be experiencing anxiety in the context of climate change. We offer a range of services throughout the community across Australia, specifically in instances of young people and family and their community impacted by the effects of climate change, like the bushfires of 2019. So our work is primarily in the early intervention space, promoting mental health literacy and raising skills in young people and their family to look after their mental health and well-being to build resilience, which we know is an important factor in supporting young people during existential anxiety like climate change anxiety. So we've been working really closely with our youth reference groups at Headspace National and partnering with our Headspace Centre network to gain insights from what young people are experiencing and helping using those voices to inform the way we write, consider and construct our interventions. So some of the interventions and work and supports that Headspace offer are, our online educational spaces and resources. So we've developed resources for young people who may be experiencing anxiety in the context of climate change, and resources for family who are supporting young people, because we see the value in family inclusive practice and supporting young people during this very difficult and often challenging time, which is adolescence and early adulthood. In addition to that, we run a range of programs across school communities, partnering with schools to build mental health literacy of the workforce there, so we can embed approaches to understanding mental health literacy and the challenges associated within school curricula, lessons, and the policies and practices that schools undertake. We have a range of online services, from interactive tools for young people. So they're not specific to climate anxiety, but we do have a range of range of activities around learning skills for a tough time, building motivation, challenging unhelpful thoughts, overcoming anxiety, learning to communicate assertively. So part of our tips and resources for young people in the space of climate anxiety is around tips to get engaged with the conversation, to be involved, maybe communicating with local government, having conversations around climate change and being able to voice their experiences and concerns, but also providing practical tips around how they might be able to take some action. Certainly, we know that young people have said to us that when they feel like they have something to do on the challenge, they feel, they've reported anecdotally reduced distress from concerns around climate change. We also promote young people taking, conscious breaks from the media and social media that they might consume around climate-related news, climate-related events, and then again within that, looking after themselves space. So we've got a number of resources online that help that young people can do in their own time. But we also have a step care model of care in our support. So we do have online communities where young people come together and talk about their experiences. We have online access to mental health staff that can provide counselling. And we also have a range of over 150 centres across the country that are providing support to young people for a range of challenges that they may be facing, including climate anxiety.
Yeah, thanks, Rupert. That's a really great overview, and congratulations to Headspace. I was going to ask this question to Rupert, but actually I'm thinking, Tianna, it's more appropriate if I put this one to you rather than having adults speak on the behalf of the youth. We've got panellists here today who are actively engaged with youth in developing solutions and ways that we can support youth with the issues that we're talking about today. From your experience and your perspective, what are the really important things to consider when we are, as researchers and program developers, are trying to initiate work that involves youth? So when we engage with youth throughout the process, from sort of the very initial stages of thinking up ideas of how we could support youth right through to the execution of a program or a research project, what are the really important things from your perspective to consider?
That's a good question for me, because I've been involved in all sorts of projects with all sorts of organisations for a very long time now. For the last 5 years, I've been doing a lot of volunteering. I think the number one thing that I always want people to remember, and especially now that I work in the youth participation space and I help facilitate young people to come in and participate and engage in all sorts of activities across all sorts of different communities and issues, is to remember that young people don't necessarily come with trust of adults, and that you can't just expect it. There's obviously a lot of feelings that adults don't know how to run things and how to listen and how to actually, I think there's a feeling of they just don't care about our futures and what's going to happen to us. And there's kind of a lack of empathy towards how we're supposed to navigate a world that we don't have any control over and we don't get to make any of the decisions for, but everyone else is making decisions that's only really seeming to consider themselves. And this is obviously, I'm getting this sort of feedback from young people who participated in Your Voice. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog. So I think the number one thing to remember is that you have to gain young people's trust when you want to engage with them, and gaining their trust can look like acknowledging the fact that they are volunteering for you and that they're actually taking time out of their lives and their days, and they're giving you their mental energy and their thoughts and their feelings, and they deserve to have those thoughts and feelings taken seriously. And also there needs to be a level of understanding that it can be quite a lot to volunteer on top of studying and working. And sorry, she's really going off.
All good.
Yeah, what we do in our program is we give young people honorariums, which kind of pays them for their time once a financial quarter. It's not like a wage, but we acknowledge that they've given us something that takes a lot of mental energy for them. And so I think it's important to show young people that they're appreciated, and also to keep them in the conversation as it continues, and to feed back to them, and don't just take their information without closing the loop and saying, this is what we're going to do with your information and what you've said, and we've heard you, and this is what we've changed about what we're thinking because of what you've said to us. So that's,
yeah, thanks, Tianna. And it's just so important to hear from young people like you when we're talking about this issue, because it's definitely a different world that you're growing up into what the rest of the panellists grew up in. So thanks so much for that perspective. I've actually got some questions here in the Q&A. I might throw this to Ans and Tara to research, but there might be other panellists, so feel free to jump in. This question is, has your research found any socioeconomic differences in how young people experience climate change?
I can have a very quick answer to that. Like, we specifically looked at that in the US sample, so that might be quite different to Australia, but we found some that we aren't finding statistically significant, but they were very small effects. And I think we really would need to do what was more like a representative sort of survey or assessment of people's feelings. I think at this point in time, I think what Tianna was sort of alluding to, like, people come to us and say, like, we want to talk, but we're maybe not capturing like the broad spectrum of what people are thinking and feeling, because people who don't trust us as researchers or as adults are not coming to us. And so I think that's also kind of interesting to look at in the future. So thanks also for pointing it out, Tianna.
Yeah, does anyone else have a response to that question about socioeconomic differences in responses to climate change?
I'll just add on as well, Fiona. This isn't my research in particular, but it's part of the paper that we put together and published earlier this year. But we did point out that there are definitely going to be differences in how young people experience climate change, and thus the kind of anxiety that they'll experience based on where they're living. So young people who are from different socioeconomic backgrounds are obviously going to experience climate change differently, and they're also going to have differences in how many resources they have and how much safety they have and how much ability to respond they have. And also we see this difference from different countries as well. So not just within societies, but across different countries. The majority of young people do live in the global south, where we might say that these are developing countries, and these young people are going to be most impacted by climate change initially, and they will have less resources and ability to respond. And it will also exacerbate a lot of the existing vulnerabilities that these young people are already experiencing in these countries. So we can definitely think that young people are going to absolutely respond in different ways depending on how differentially they are impacted.
Yeah, it's a great response, Tara. Thanks for highlighting that. And that we do think, or we anticipate, that climate change will act as an amplifier that you pointed out, exacerbating already existing inequalities in terms of health outcomes or mental health outcomes. So whilst the research on specific social or economic determinants of mental health is not there yet, it needs to be done. We're in the very early stages of research in this area. It is to be expected that those already known social and economic determinants of mental health will be exacerbated. So that's a great question. Thank you for that. Does anyone else have any comments on that question before we move on? No, great. Next question. This participant, thanks for the question, would love to hear panellists' thoughts about the messaging of hope, engagement and activism, and the risk of placing additional burden on children and their generation to solve the climate crisis. I'm going to open that up to possibly anyone, because everyone has got experience with young people here, and particularly Tianna.
I can share some thoughts.
Please.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you for that. I do think there is a challenge in when we are working with young people, and certainly in my experience working with young people who are experiencing climate-related anxiety, around the risk of feeling like we are burdening them with the need to change and shape the behaviour of future generations and to have all the answers. Certainly in the work that I've done with young people around addressing their concerns and providing them with practical kind of strategies that make them feel a little bit, give them a sense of control. Certainly that has been really valuable for young people, and certainly anecdotally have reported back to me that they has reduced some of the distress or psychological distress they've experienced when they're ruminating or thinking about the climate-related anxiety. Certainly in my work with young people, part of my job at Headspace is to make sure that we are embedding the voices of young people within the work that we do and the interventions and the support we provide the community. It's been a really loud message from young people that that it is the responsibility of the community as a whole to come together to solve this challenge. I was really taken aback actually recently in a conversation with a group of young people when we were talking about the top challenges for young people in the surveyed young people were having for in Australia, and certainly housing inequality and access to rent and education costs were far more present as a form of psychological distress for young people. And I remember one young person directly said to me, "Are we still talking about climate change? This is something we need to move on together as a community. It's something that it can't be unfairly placed on our shoulders." So my thoughts on this topic are that, we do need to have a conversation. There are things that we can do to support young people to feel like they have a sense of agency. But most importantly, we should be building hope and resilience for young people.
Yeah, thanks, Rupert.
I would add something as well to this. I went to a friend's house party to welcome them to their new house. They were just moved out to live on their own, and there was a bunch of under 23-year-olds hanging out. And we were sitting around talking about the climate crisis and the cost of living and mental health and pandemics, and would more pandemics come because of the climate crisis, because that's what the research was saying in the news. It was saying that more stuff like this was going to keep happening. And this feeling of losing your youth to a pandemic and to a climate crisis, and not getting the chance to just be a young person, and instead of getting to go to a club and have fun and just have a normal house party, you're sitting there talking to your friends about the end of the world. I went home, my mum asked me how the party was, and I said, I don't know, we talked about the climate crisis for 3 hours. And my mum was like, I was not doing that as a teenager at all. I was not having these kinds of conversations. And my mom has been protesting and going to climate crisis protests since the 90s. So my mom was having those things happening then, and I'm still talking about this now, except now it's infiltrated everything, and I'm not having really any sort of just young, youthful party sort of interactions with people. I think that burden is quite a lot, because it feels like there's no one who's taking it seriously. But I will say that an intergenerational approach is really important, because when you have people, like I know that my mum's been caring about this issue her whole life. That's really important to me, that we don't feel like we're alone, and we do feel like people care. And I always get very excited when I see like people in their 80s at climate protests, because I'm like, yay, we're all in this together. So
thanks so much, Tianna. And I'd love to ask you more questions on that about, other things that you talk about, whether there's hope. But I'm conscious of the time, and we've got one last question that I'd really like to get to, because I think it's an important one that we haven't touched on yet. This question comes from Nayani, and is particularly interested about the experiences or what we can do to support culturally and linguistically diverse people, young people. And this person is particularly thinking about newly migrated people from overseas, and who are, coming to Queensland or Brisbane, for example, and are experiencing the terrible floods. So does anyone have any comments on that? Andy, do you have an experience with that with Outback Futures?
Not specifically in those cultural sort of dynamics that we've experienced a whole lot of shifting around. I just want to touch on, though, what has been sort of added over the last couple of questions is that mental health doesn't operate in the silo of just climate change, that there are numerous factors that are impacting the mental health of young people. And so one of those may be their cultural experience or their cultural heritage, but others may be their unemployment or the geographical isolation, learning difficulties or other things as well. And so I think that's what I'm seeing and noticing in the communities that we're working in, that it isn't just one topic of climate change that is the impact on the mental health, but it's an undercurrent of that on top of whatever else might be experiencing. And I particularly say that the voice of people who live in remote areas is often lost in those conversations as well, on how the climate change is impacting their environment and their context. And to reiterate as well, that whole community approach of trying to bring the voice together in a collective sense, because the severe weather events in remote parts of Queensland have the capacity to, in actual fact, wipe out some communities and towns where people reside. So what happens then? Well, we really do need that whole community approach to bring in people, avail that voice, and to share together about what can we do as a community to take our step forward with this concept.
Yeah, great answer. Thanks, Andy. Carla.
I was just going to add to, similar to what Andy was saying, that it's really important to make sure that we're hearing different voices and that everyone's experience and every community experience and how we perceive events and respond to events is going to be unique and individual, and to listen to that shared experience from all different types of community experiences, because that's going to be a very different experience for someone who might be newly arrived in the southeast Queensland region at the moment. And it's important to hear everyone's journey is going to be experienced differently. So the importance of, I'm sure quite a number of you this morning have spoken about the importance of co-design. And Tianna also mentioned the importance of closing that loop back, so that communities that we have engaged in a co-design process or listen to their experience, that they have the knowledge that we are acting and responding and listening to their shared experience as well.
Yeah, fabulous, Carla. All right, we nearly.
Fiona, sorry. I just wanted to add on another point about people from different cultures, and that there potentially does need to be a little bit of a shift away from expecting that we should, come up with these special interventions for people from different cultures, but rather I think we have a lot to learn from people of different cultures and how they're responding to climate change as a community and how they're helping each other and to be resilient as a community. There's lots of different cultures who are doing that, and a lot of First Nations people who are using their cultural knowledge and their traditions to restore the environment. And I think we do have a lot to learn from that as well. And we should incorporate that, as Carla has been saying, co-designing, coming up with ways that we can help ourselves and our communities based on learning from other cultures.
Yeah, great point, Tara. Thank you. We are just about out of time, but I'm going to go around the panel for last comment, perhaps in relation to what we're really trying to achieve as a network, as a research network, which is to collaborate and co-design research to support in our industry partners. So maybe I'll just leave that quite open. What do you think is the role of research? How can we support going forward? Rupert, I might start with you.
Thanks, Fiona. I think research is really important, especially in this space. I think one of the challenges of making sure that we have really safe and evidence-informed interventions for young people and their family is really clarifying and defining what the challenge is as a service provider. So having a good understanding of how we can support young people, so understanding the maintenance factors, etiologies, all those contributing factors for climate anxiety for young people. It's really complex. So I think research is really vital, and sharing research across services and including the voices of young people in these decisions that we are making with this research is a really vital way that moving forward we can support young people in Australia and across the world.
Yeah, thanks. Very good. Carla?
Similar to Rupert, it's such a field where we're really seeking out evidence-informed strategies that we are aware that are going to support communities through some of these events and experiences. So we're definitely looking to you in that space, and definitely appreciative of the conversation and the work.
Thanks, Carla. Who else have we got? Tianna.
I think from my perspective, my hope is that the research showing the impacts of the environment on more than just the planet itself, but on people's well-being and health will actually push the people in charge to make changes to actually solve the climate crisis.
Thanks. Andy.
Yeah, I'd just like to remember that data tells a story, and that's a beautiful thing. And we need to capture that data from broad parts of our nation and tell the stories from all parts of this great place that we call home.
Fabulous. Lovely. Thanks, Andy. Tara.
Well, I think we've spoken quite a lot today about how young people experience climate change and climate anxiety very differently. And I think the role of research is to help identify what those different young people need and how we can best support those young people based on what they need, whether that's emotionally, whether that's practically as a community. I think research can really identify those opportunities for how we support young people.
Yeah. That's right. Thanks, Tara. And Anne, I know you've got some future plans for research.
No, I think, echoing what everybody said here, as research is also engaging with policy. I think that's really important, helping to translate all those findings, but really having spaces like this and others where we can all get together and really meet each other and talk about, okay, what are the needs and what can we help with as researchers, and how can we translate that into sort of meaningful messages that someone's going to listen to, the people have the decision-making power. I think that's really the key.
Yeah, fabulous point. And it's totally on point. Collaboration is the key. I don't think any one or even two of us are going to be able to come up with the much needed answers that research can provide. So I am just so enormously grateful to all of our panellists and all of the people online who have come to listen to this webinar this morning. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You will be able to re-watch or point others to this webinar recording on our website in the coming days, and stay tuned for our next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. It was really great.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.